There are moments in life when human beings pause amid the hurried flow of the world and ask themselves, why do we suffer? This suffering does not always take on a clear shape. Sometimes it is a vague, nameless sadness, a sense of emptiness in the midst of success, or a quiet unease even when everything seems to be fine. One may have enough material comforts, have people by one's side, have a future already laid out, yet deep within still feel lacking, heavy, and exhausted. Buddhism calls this dukkha, suffering, a fundamental truth, not to cast life in a pessimistic light, but to look directly into the nature of existence. From the Buddhist perspective, suffering is not limited to pain, illness, or loss. It is far more subtle than that. It hides in the fear of losing what we already have, in desires that are never truly satisfied, in our resistance to impermanence. People often think suffering comes from external circumstances, others hurt us, life is unfair, fate is too harsh. But in the light of Buddhist wisdom, suffering is not something random or a form of punishment, it is the natural result of the way we perceive and cling to the world. The Buddha did not begin the path to enlightenment with a promise of eternal happiness. He began by pointing directly to the truth of suffering. The Four Noble Truths open with the truth of suffering, like an honest doorway leading practitioners into the depth of awareness. What is remarkable is that Buddhism does not ask us to run away from suffering, nor does it advise us to deny or conceal it. On the contrary, the Buddha taught us to turn back and look directly at suffering, to observe it with mindfulness, to understand its origins, and from there, to discover the path to liberation. To understand suffering through the Buddhist lens is an inner journey, not a dry philosophical concept. It is the direct observation of each sensation, each thought, each subtle reaction. In daily life, when a word makes us uncomfortable, when a desire is not fulfilled, when we feel fear in the face of change, all of these are living expressions of suffering. Buddhism invites us to look into these very ordinary moments, because it is precisely there that the roots of suffering are quietly at work. In modern life, the more people try to avoid suffering, the more refined and subtle it becomes. We turn to busyness to forget emptiness, to entertainment to fill unease, to achievement to affirm our self-worth. Yet these efforts often bring only temporary comfort. When the pleasure fades, when the busyness settles, suffering returns, sometimes even deeper than before. Buddhism does not deny worldly joys, but it points out that if we rely entirely on them to find peace, we will never escape the endless cycle of suffering. What makes the Buddhist view distinctive is its compassion and realism. The Buddha did not say that people suffer because they are weak or morally flawed. He pointed out that suffering arises from ignorance, from not seeing clearly the impermanent and non-self nature of all phenomena. When we believe that everything must go our way, when we assume happiness comes from holding on, when we identify ourselves with emotions and thoughts, suffering naturally arises. There is no blame here, only a lack of understanding, and therefore, always the possibility of transformation. Opening the door to understanding suffering through Buddhism also means learning to listen to ourselves. Not to complain about fate, but to recognize the recurring patterns of the mind. We begin to see that much suffering does not come from circumstances, but from how we respond to them. The same situation can cause one person to suffer and leave another untouched. The difference does not lie in the outer world, but in each person's inner landscape. Recognizing this is the first step toward freedom. This article is a gentle invitation to step into the Buddhist view of suffering. Not to sink into darkness, but to kindle the light of understanding. When suffering is understood correctly, it is no longer an enemy, but a silent teacher, showing us where we are clinging, where we are afraid, and where we can let go. From there, the path of transformation is no longer distant, but begins right here. In each moment of mindfulness in present-day life, from the Buddhist perspective, suffering is not an abnormal accident that happens in human life, but a natural part of existence when the mind remains in ignorance. The Buddha observed human life very deeply and realized that no matter which social class one belongs to, whether rich or poor, whether loved or lonely, suffering is still present in different forms. Suffering does not lie only in major events such as illness, separation, or death, but is also hidden in very small things, an unfulfilled desire, a word that wounds the ego, or a vague anxiety about a future that has not yet arrived. Buddhism analyzes suffering with great subtlety, beginning from the lived experience of each individual. Birth itself is suffering. Not because life is bad, but because from the very moment of appearing, a human being must face limitation, dependence, and impermanence. Growing up is suffering, because we gradually realize that the world does not operate according to our wishes. Aging is suffering, because the body weakens, memory fades, and what was once familiar slowly moves away. Death is suffering, because of fear of the unknown and attachment to life. This chain of suffering is not meant to plunge human beings into despair, but to point out a truth that must be faced directly if one wishes to find a way beyond it. Going deeper, Buddhism points out that the root of suffering does not lie in external circumstances, but in the clinging mind. When the mind clings to pleasure, it fears loss. When the mind clings to status, it fears failure. When the mind clings to relationships, it fears separation. This very clinging causes human beings to live in a constant state of unease, no matter how favorable the circumstances may be. Joy therefore becomes fragile, because it is always accompanied by the fear of losing it. A key point in the Buddhist view is the truth of impermanence. All phenomena arise and pass away, nothing exists forever. Yet human beings behave as if everything must be lasting, must remain according to their wishes. We want joy to continue, want youth not to fade, want feelings not to change. When reality does not meet these expectations, suffering arises. It is not because impermanence itself is the direct cause of suffering, but because we resist impermanence. If we can see impermanence clearly and accept it, the mind becomes much lighter. Alongside impermanence, Buddhism also points out the nature of non-self. What we call I is in fact only a temporary combination of body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. There is no fixed, unchanging self to cling to. But because we do not see this clearly, we identify ourselves with thoughts, emotions, and social roles. When criticized, we think, I am being insulted. When we fail, we think, I am useless. When we experience loss, we think, I cannot go on living. This identification is what makes suffering heavy and persistent. Buddhism does not stop at analyzing suffering, but also helps us recognize how suffering operates in each moment. Whenever an unpleasant sensation appears, the mind usually tends to resist or avoid it. We want to push sadness away, to cover fear with busyness or entertainment. But the more we resist, the stronger suffering becomes. The Buddha taught that only when we dare to stay with the feeling, observe it with mindfulness, without judgment and without identification, does suffering begin to lose its power. Another profound truth is that suffering is personal, but not unique. Everyone suffers, only the forms are different. When we understand this, compassion begins to arise, not only toward others, but toward ourselves. We stop blaming ourselves for being weak, stop comparing our pain with that of others. Buddhism helps us see that suffering is not a failure of life, but an invitation to return and look again at how we are living and how we are perceiving. In modern life, suffering often takes on more subtle forms. It is not always hunger or war, but stress, anxiety, depression, and a sense of being lost. Human beings have more choices than ever before, yet less peace. Buddhism saw this very clearly thousands of years ago. When desire grows while wisdom does not keep pace, suffering is unavoidable. Understanding suffering through the Buddhist lens is therefore not something ancient or outdated, but deeply necessary for people today. When we begin to understand suffering in this way, a quiet transformation takes place. We no longer see suffering as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a sign showing where clinging still exists within us. Each time suffering appears becomes an opportunity to learn, to let go, and to see ourselves more clearly. This is an important step on the path of awakening, where suffering no longer leads us into dead ends, but opens the door to understanding and inner freedom. When looking back over the entire journey of contemplating suffering in the light of Buddhism, we can recognize one very important thing: suffering is not the end point of life, but the starting point of awakening. Without suffering, human beings would remain asleep in illusions about happiness, about the self, about the permanence of the world. It is suffering that causes us to stop, to question, and to begin seeking a deeper path for our lives. In the Buddhist view, suffering is neither denied nor glorified, but seen exactly as it is, a phenomenon that needs to be understood, not something to be escaped from. When suffering is understood correctly, one's way of living begins to change. We are no longer overly surprised or resentful when suffering appears, because we see it as a natural part of the impermanent flow of life. We also no longer rush to push suffering away through external means, but learn to turn back and observe our own mind. This turning back brings a very quiet strength, the strength of understanding. And when there is understanding, suffering may still be there, but it no longer dominates the entire inner life as it once did. Buddhism does not promise that through practice suffering will completely disappear. What Buddhism offers is freedom in the way we face suffering. When we no longer identify ourselves with sensations, no longer see each sadness as me, or each failure as me, suffering naturally becomes lighter. It comes and goes, like clouds passing through the sky, no longer obscuring the whole inner space. This is not an escape from reality, but a very awake way of living within reality. Understanding suffering through the Buddhist lens also helps us develop compassion naturally. When we see clearly that everyone carries their own forms of suffering, we become less harsh toward others. We are not quick to judge or to conclude, because we know that behind every action and every word there is often some unrecognized anxiety or fear. At the same time, we learn to be gentler with ourselves, allowing ourselves to be weak, to make mistakes, and to learn from our stumbles. In an increasingly noisy world, where people are swept along by speed, information, and the pressure to be happy, the Buddhist view of suffering becomes extremely precious. It reminds us that peace does not come from eliminating all difficulties, but from a deep understanding of the nature of life. When we dare to face suffering, without avoidance, without embellishment, we begin to live more truthfully with ourselves. And from that truth, a very deep kind of peace can arise. If you are listening to these words and recognize somewhere the image of yourself in the sufferings mentioned, remember that you are not alone. The path of understanding and transforming suffering is one that many people have walked and are still walking. Each slow step, each moment of mindfulness, has its value. There is no need to rush, no need to be perfect. It is enough to sincerely turn back, observe, and learn from your own experiences. If this content resonates with you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences with suffering and how you are facing it in your life. Your sharing is not only a voice for yourself, but can also become a source of empathy for others who are on a similar journey. And if you feel that these gentle Buddhist perspectives bring you calmness and understanding, please subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying content that helps nurture mindfulness, wisdom, and inner peace. The journey of understanding suffering is not to live more sadly, but to live more deeply. When suffering is illuminated by wisdom, it is no longer a burden, but a doorway opening to inner freedom. And from that very place, a life that is gentle, mindful, and full of compassion can gradually take shape.